What's going on, guys? Billy here, and for the past 2 years, the DJI Mavic 2 Pro has been dominant in the drone market, and it's rightfully so. It's got a great design, it's got great specs, and of course, its standout feature, it's got a great camera. I'm really impressed at how it was able to weather the storm of other drone releases from Autel's Evo 2, the Skydio 2, even though that really was an entirely different drone, and even the Mavic Air 2, which crept up right on its heels. All good things at some point in time must come to an end, but fortunately for those of us that have been salivating for a brand new drone that's better or at least comparable to the Mavic 2 Pro, DJI delivered with an unsuspecting entry to their drone lineup in the Air 2S. It's a refresh of the Mavic Air 2, and I actually think that it's better than the Mavic 2 Pro in certain areas, even though it's slotted underneath of the Mavic 2 Pro in DJI's entire drone lineup. And I mentioned this in my previous review video that I posted a couple of days ago. I'll link that up in the top right corner if you guys want to check that out. So what I want to do in today's video is go over my logic as to why the Air 2S is now my go-to drone over the Mavic 2 Pro. So what often made me reach for my Mavic 2 Pro over any other drone was its camera. The larger sensor, its ability to capture 10-bit color when shooting video, and the fact that it could take full 20 megapixel photos without using any quad bay or center tricks. Most of the photos that I've posted up to my Instagram over the past few years have been taken from my Mavic 2 Pro, with a few sprinkled in here and there from the Mavic Air 2 and the Autel Evo 2, which, by the way, over the next coming weeks, I'm going to be posting a lot of photos taken with the Air 2S over on my page. So if you want to follow me over there, my handle is @BillyKyle. Anyway, with the release of the Air 2S, they've more or less taken that same camera system and shrunk it down to fit in a smaller airframe. The camera itself retains the same general design as you can see, but it's definitely much smaller as to fit the smaller drone better. Because the camera system in this drone is newer and different, there are some differences in the shooting specs, both for the better and for the worse. So that means that some functionality was taken away while some features were added. With that being said, the cameras are still very similar, and it's really clear when we look at the specs side by side. The sensor size is the same, the megapixel count and image resolution is the same, the color profiles available are the same on both of these cameras, and they still have very similar shooting modes. The only real differences comes in these highlighted areas on both sides. The Air 2S has the ability to shoot video in 4K at 60 frames per second and higher resolution video at 5.4K, which is made possible by the higher maximum bitrate of 150 megabits per second. The only real upside that comes as a result of using the Mavic 2 Pro's camera is the variable aperture of f2.8 to f11, which can be controlled directly from your remote on the fly. The Air 2S, on the other hand, has a fixed aperture of f2.8. I really can't downplay the loss of that variable aperture here in the Air 2S because it was such an important component in helping me expose my images when shooting with the Mavic 2 Pro. Now, when you're shooting with like a DSLR or a mirrorless camera down on the ground, that aperture is going to have a huge role in how your image looks, right? It's going to change the depth of field. It's going to add or take away the blur or the bokeh in the background when you focus on your subject. On the other hand, when shooting with a drone though, really no matter what your aperture is at, everything is going to be in focus. There's no depth of field when you're shooting a subject that's hundreds of feet away. So your aperture really didn't matter. There are going to be some people out there that say shooting at a certain aperture is going to produce a sharper image, and while they might be right, it's very marginal, and I would just use that aperture no matter what it was at to properly expose my image dependent upon the ND filter and the lighting, because at the end of the day, I would rather just have a properly exposed image, and the variable aperture helped me out a lot. Really quickly, just jumping back to this shot here, do you guys remember the size difference of these cameras? Well, I think that this has something to do with the lack of a variable aperture inside of the Air 2S. There probably wasn't as much space to fit the necessary hardware inside of the camera housing. You know, come to think of it, DJI also probably didn't want to entirely step on the toes of the Mavic 2 Pro, and they wanted to save some of those professional level features for their highest end foldable drone in the Mavic 2 Pro, but nonetheless, it still is easy to control your exposure when shooting video using a ND filter, but it's just not as easy as simply changing the aperture right from your remote controller on the fly. Speaking of shooting video, let's take a look at some example images from both of these drones. We'll first start off with some photos. Now, these are raw images taken in the DNG file format with no editing done whatsoever. I find that right out of the camera, the Air 2S photos look ever so slightly better than the same images captured on the Mavic 2 Pro. My thought process is that the colors pop just a little bit more and the photos are also a bit more punchy, but let's be real, most of the photos captured on either of these drones are often going to be edited, so what the photo looks like right out of the camera really isn't all that important. With that said, switching to looking at some edited versions of the photos, the files from both of these cameras are really easy to work with and have plenty of dynamic range to get a great looking image. You can push the exposure too through the highlights and shadows pretty hard without introducing much noise. I would call this a tie because they are both so good, but if you want to decide for yourself, then go ahead and check out the link in the description to view and edit some sample raw files for yourself. Now, switching over to the video side of things, this is where the Air 2S starts to run away with the show because of the higher resolution that's available. 5.4K gives you more room to crop in after the fact if you need to do so, and it just overall looks sharper on your screen. Of course, the bitrate is higher too, but that's just to compensate for the higher pixel count when shooting that 5.4K video. Now, everything that you guys are watching here on the screen was captured in the normal color profile. It's been unedited, and I used automatic exposure settings and automatic white balance to see what the cameras could do. Of course, you can squeeze some more dynamic range out of these images when using the D-Log or HLG color profile, which along with the available video clips shot in the normal color profile will be available for download through the link in the description. Now, the variable aperture admittedly is more important when you're shooting video rather than photos to maintain the 180-degree shutter rule, so it makes it easier to keep your shutter speed double that of your frame rate, but I found that as long as you can do the heavy lifting of getting your exposure close to perfect with an ND filter, it isn't going to totally ruin your footage if you have to make slight adjustments with your shutter or the ISO. Like, your video isn't going to be ruined if you need to use an ISO of 400 or a shutter of 1/100th to dial in the exposure. To close out our discussion on the cameras found in both of these drones, it is really hard to choose a clear winner because both of them have their own strengths and both of them have their own weaknesses. So for example, if you wanted to have a drone's camera that could shoot high resolution video, you go with the Air 2S and its ability to shoot 5.4K video. If instead you're really worried about controlling exposure, then maybe the Mavic 2 Pro is the better choice for you with its variable aperture. So at the end of the day, I don't think that there's a clear winner here when we talk about shooting with these two drones in terms of like the camera, but it's all up to you. It's about your personal preference. And that's why I think that right now, this is where the true comparison starts as we talk about flight characteristics, flight specs, the airframe itself, and of course the price. Like, one of the huge benefits to buying the Air 2S is that it's just newer. There are a few design elements that really stand out as being better, like the battery clips that are made of metal instead of plastic. They fit so snugly inside of the drone that I have no worries about them popping out mid-flight. There's no wiggle at all when you try to move them back and forth. Speaking of batteries, the Mavic 2 batteries also have a massive swelling problem, which renders them unusable once they've swollen up. It's a widespread issue that almost every owner of a Mavic 2 drone that I've spoken with has dealt with. The Mavic Air 2 batteries, on the other hand, have held up really well after a year for myself as well as many others. Really quickly, to stay on that topic of build and design, the legs when folding in don't rub against the drone on the Air 2S like they do on the Mavic 2 airframe, and they also feel like they're just constructed better. Like, the different parts here are rock solid with no bending or no bowing. Perhaps my favorite upgrade though that comes as a result of the Air 2S being newer is the general design and construction of the gimbal, which is far superior. To be clear, it's not like the Mavic 2 Pro gimbal was plagued with issues, but there was one issue that just drove me crazy. You see, when flying in sport mode, the camera on the drone wouldn't be able to stay level with the horizon. It would kick downwards to the ground, and no matter how hard you tried to pitch it back upwards, it wouldn't. It would be limited to still look down towards the ground. Now, the reason that something like this happens, which I've explained a couple of times in some previous videos, is because of how the camera sits underneath of the drone's body. So as you pitch the drone forward, it's going to block the camera, and so that you don't have half of the camera blocked or half the frame blocked by the body of the drone, the camera then just defaults to shooting downwards and getting the actual body of the drone out of the frame. The Air 2S, on the other hand, has a gimbal that was designed much better and can fly at its maximum 42 miles an hour while maintaining a level horizon without the camera shooting down to the ground to compensate. It's a much more immersive experience that won't totally ruin your shot if you're flying fast in sport mode. Now let's move on and get into arguably the biggest upgrade that the Air 2S received, and that is the O3 transmission system that was first introduced in the DJI FPV drone, but it's made its way here into the Air lineup of drones. I covered the characteristics in my Air 2S review video of the transmission system that the Mavic 2 Pro uses, called OcuSync 2, and the newer O3 transmission system in the Air 2S, but when you look at these specs on paper, you might not be able to notice all that much of a difference, as the frequency, the downlink quality, the bitrate, and the latency are all exactly the same. The biggest difference comes in the range though, which honestly isn't all that much of an increase. Like, what, is 10 kilometers or 6.21 miles in OcuSync 2 not enough? I'm almost afraid to say it in this video because I mentioned it so much in my review video of the Air 2S, but the biggest upgrade that separates OcuSync 2 from O3 is the strength and the fidelity of the signal that O3 is able to transmit. So with the Air 2S, we've got a quad antenna setup, so 4 separate antennas compared to 2 antennas inside of like the Mavic 2 Pro and the Mavic Air 2, both of which used OcuSync 2. So in my time using the Air 2S in a relatively congested area with a lot of wireless interference, I've had barely any lag, barely any signal breakup, and quite frankly, it's the biggest thing that attributes to the smooth flight of this drone because there's no interruptions. So another thing that I touched on pretty extensively in my review of the Air 2S are these top sensors that are angled slightly forward to also work when you're flying forward. So effectively, this gives you 4 sensors that face forwards to detect obstacles instead of 2. So there are a couple of great benefits that come as a result to using a sensor layout like the one found on the Air 2S. For one, it's going to be a lot more reliable at detecting obstacles around the drone. Of course, now we have 4 sensors pointing forwards instead of the standard 2 found on plenty of DJI's older drones. So it's going to be a lot more reliable at detecting those obstacles. And in terms of flying upwards, we now have 2 true obstacle avoidance sensors, which have never been found on any of DJI's drones. Like the Mavic 2 Pro has this infrared sensor, but it's not a true dual set of obstacle avoidance sensors. Now, another great benefit to using a sensor layout like this is that you get a faster maximum speed while the sensors are turned on. Now, the difference between the Mavic Air 2 to the Air 2S is pretty substantial, but the Mavic 2 Pro is still pretty quick when flying with those sensors turned on. So just to give you an understanding of like what the difference is, the vertical speed is 11 miles an hour in the Mavic 2 Pro, and the max vertical speed in the Air 2S is 13 miles an hour. So it is just a little bit faster, but really not all that much. Now, when we're talking about the horizontal speed, like how fast the drone can fly forwards with all the sensors turned on, the Mavic 2 Pro has a top speed of 30 miles an hour, while the Air 2S has a top speed of 33 miles an hour. So it's cool to see that they are getting faster now while using all of those sensors and having them turned on. And it's going to be really cool to see where that technology is in a couple of years from now. Now, on the other hand, what the Mavic 2 Pro has going for it is more total sensors that cover every side of the drone. So there's a single sensor on each side here for true omnidirectional obstacle avoidance. This omnidirectional obstacle avoidance unfortunately only works in certain flight modes. For example, tripod mode, where the drone is flying a little bit slower, because as you can imagine, you've got 2 sensors to rely on most sides of this drone, but on the sides of the drone here, like right here, it's only got 1 sensor to rely on, so it's not going to be able to work when you're flying at that full maximum speed. Of course, the infrared sensor up here is also kind of dinky. It's not a true obstacle avoidance system or obstacle avoidance sensor. So what I would say is that DJI is definitely going in the right direction with the Air 2S, but just like everything about these 2 drones, they're just a little bit different. It's not like one is better than the other, because the Air 2S is great at sensing obstacles directly forwards, but it doesn't have true omnidirectional obstacle avoidance. So almost just like how I left off the whole discussion of the cameras, you almost want to choose which drone works best for your style of flight. So moving on here, I figured a way to cover some quick ground in this comparison is to show some of the general specs of these drones, which further shows that the gap here is really close. The advertised flight time in both of these drones is the same. The speed is marginally different in favor of the Mavic 2 Pro in sport mode. Of course, we already discussed the range is a little bit further on the Air 2S. They also have the same wind resistance rating. They both feature 8 gigabytes of internal storage, and both drones shoot hyperlapses. I swear that making this video is totally messing with my brain because both of these drones are just so similar, but at the same time, they are so different and probably cater to very different people. Like for me, as I mentioned, I really do prefer the Air 2S for a lot of reasons that I'm going to kind of summarize at the end of this video. But at the same time, somebody might not even look at this drone because it doesn't have a variable aperture. I mean, these 2 drones being so similar really do cater to the needs of very different people. So what I want to do to wrap this video up is go over some different topics, rapid fire, that I think are really important to cover in this comparison, but that I just really don't have all that much to talk about. The price difference in these drones is pretty substantial, with the Mavic 2 Pro costing $600 more for the base version and $700 more for the Fly More combo. This was a premium price that now feels a little bit too expensive considering the Air 2S has packed a lot of the same tech into a less expensive drone. On this topic of price, the batteries individually are also $35 less expensive, which can really add up if you plan on buying a few extras for a longer flight. The size of the Air 2S is obviously smaller than the Mavic 2 Pro, which means it takes up less space in your bag. The Air 2S uses the DJI Fly app, while the Mavic 2 Pro uses the DJI Go app. Both are great companion apps, and I really have come to favor the Fly app as it's been built rolled out with more and more features over the years, but the DJI Go app is still a better fit for power users as it has more functions to further tune how your drone flies. The Air 2S has an ADS-B receiver so that you can see manned aircraft right in the Fly app. This is great for better awareness of the airspace around you. The Mavic 2 line of drones features a dual IMU and dual compass setup, which proves to be more redundant than the single IMU and single compass in the Air 2S. If one of these sensors were to fail mid-flight, the Mavic 2 Pro would be able to fall back to the other sensor. And as for the Air 2S, well, I think you know what would happen if one of the sensors failed. The remotes for these drones are significantly different, and while I have come to like the screen position on the Air 2S remote a lot more up above my hands, you can't deny that having a built-in screen for telemetry on the Mavic 2 Pro screen is really nice to have. Even though the Air 2S has newer, upgraded flight modes like Master Shots and APAS 4.0, the Mavic 2 Pro actually has a longer list of intelligent flight modes like waypoints, which I know is something that a lot of people really enjoy using. Now, even though I said that the advertised wind resistance rating is the same in both the Air 2S and the Mavic 2 Pro, I really can't help but think the Mavic 2 Pro is better at fighting the wind. It's bigger, it also has a faster top speed, and just from experience, I can say I feel a lot more comfortable flying it on windier days. The final thing I want to mention here is that the Air 2S is definitely quieter than the Mavic 2 Pro, but it's a pretty slim difference. Here, have a listen. So guys, there we have it. The Air 2S is the newest competitor on the block that's going toe-to-toe with the Mavic 2 Pro, and I think that it beats it. I think it just edges it out ever so slightly in a few categories, making it the better drone for me. That's my opinion. I think that these drones are just so similar that it's really difficult to say which one is better than the other, and that's why each of these drones really does cater to different people's needs. So at the end of the day, after I've just given you all of this information, you've got to try to figure out exactly which drone is right for you to meet your needs. And to help you, I've made this quick comparison list to kind of help you refer to and understand exactly which drone does what better. Figure out what your needs are and which of these drones check the most important boxes. I guess maybe all I should have really done in this video is just showed you this list and been done with it, but you guys know that I really like to go in depth. Here's something that you've got to understand though. I'm somebody that just reviews drones. I get the newest drone. I buy all of these drones regardless because I want to show them here on my YouTube channel, and I end up keeping them, right? I've got a whole entire collection sitting over there on the wall because it's great to call back to those drones and kind of see what technology once was. I'm totally getting off track here, but at the end of the day, the main question is, if you have the Mavic 2 Pro, do you upgrade or maybe downgrade to some people? Do you move from the Mavic 2 Pro platform to the Air 2S platform? That's kind of a tough sell, right? Because typically when you've got the Mavic 2 Pro, you've invested into batteries, you've invested into accessories, you've invested time into learning the familiarity of the drone and the application, and sometimes making that switch over to a drone that's seemingly just a little bit better in certain areas might be a little bit too much of a hassle. The biggest thing that's pushing me to switch over from the Mavic 2 Pro platform to the Air 2S platform is, as you guys probably could have guessed it, the O3 transmission system. It is such a monumental upgrade over OcuSync 2. Again, not because of the whole range thing, but because that wireless signal is so strong. I know that no matter where I'm flying at, I'm going to get a nice crystal clear signal, and it's going to overall give me an enhanced flight experience because I know I don't have to deal with any lag or signal breakup. It is going to be nice and crystal clear. I would say that even if this drone didn't have a 1-inch sensor and it was just the Mavic Air 2 all over again, but with that O3 transmission system, I would still be tempted to make the switch because it's that good, but it's just a bonus that this camera is so good and it really does rival the Mavic 2 Pro. Again, all of these other features I mentioned are just add-on bonuses because I would probably make the switch if it was just for O3. So this brings us to the end of the video, and it's a question that I pose whenever we get a new drone. Like, what's next? Right? Like, I know that this drone just came out, the Air 2S, but like, this drone is so close to what the Mavic 2 Pro offers. Like, what's next for the next Mavic Pro, the Mavic 3 Pro, the Mavic Pro 3, whatever it's going to be, because they can't just go and release a new version of this drone with the same size sensor that doesn't have ADS-B, that doesn't have true omnidirectional obstacle avoidance, that doesn't have, I would guess, 40 plus flight minutes, right? I mean, they're really going to have to come out with something that's badass for the Mavic 3 Pro, whatever they decide to call it, because the Air 2S is already pretty good and I can't imagine anything getting better. But of course they have a lot more room to play with here, and as we've seen in typical DJI fashion, they kind of trickle down features from their larger drones to the smaller drones and then introduce even cooler features in those bigger drones where they have more room to work. So guys, with that said, let me know what you think of these two drones and the comparison of them down below in the comment section below. And as always, I'll talk to you later. Peace.